Ever been to like a comedy show?
Hmm.
You're dying laughing, wiping away tears, and you think, how does someone actually get paid to do this?
Right, right.
So that's what we're diving into today, the wild world of stand-up comedy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's actually a lot more to it than meets the eye. Luckily, we've got some insights from RoleCatcher.
Oh yeah, they're a great resource for all things career related.
For sure, and they really get into the nitty-gritty of what it takes to make it as a stand-up.
Okay, so first things first. When we say stand-up comedian, what are we actually talking about in terms of like their actual job? It can't just be tell jokes into a microphone, right?
Definitely not. It's a whole process. It's coming up with the jokes, finding what's funny about everyday life, then having the guts to actually get up and share it with a room full of people.
And those rooms, wow, they can be anything, right? Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
I think comedy clubs, but you see stand-up everywhere.
You really do. I mean, one night it could be a tiny little bar, the next it's a huge theater. The data shows that you really got to be able to roll with the punches in this gig.
Oh, and what about hecklers?
Oh, yeah.
Talk about thinking on your feet.
That's part of the job description, right?
Mhm.
It's almost like, can you handle the pressure? Can you keep your cool when someone's trying to throw you off?
And ideally, you turned it into a joke, right?
Exactly.
Which makes me wonder, is that something you're born with, that ability to think on your feet, or is that something you can learn?
Good question. I mean, some people are naturals, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of it comes from experience, from uh, bombing enough times on stage to figure out what works.
So it's not all laughs and applause, is what you're saying.
Definitely not.
It sounds like you kind of need thick skin to make it in this field.
Yeah, the research actually talks about that, the emotional toll this career takes. Every night, you're putting yourself out there facing a lot of rejection, a lot of criticism, and you constantly have to be coming up with new stuff.
Like, you're only as good as your last joke, basically.
Pretty much.
And speaking of things that are always changing, the entertainment industry itself is evolving so fast.
It really is.
So how does that impact stand-up?
Well, the interesting thing is, even though it's always changing, the demand for stand-up is actually growing.
Really?
Yeah, more and more places are having stand-up, and with the rise of streaming services, comedians have so many more platforms. It's a good time to be in the game, in that sense.
Okay, so that's encouraging. So there's more opportunity out there, but it's still a really tough gig, right? I mean, on the one hand, you get to be creative, you make people laugh, you could travel.
Right, and there's potential to be really successful. Think about some of the big names in comedy. They've got fame, they've got money, and they're doing what they love.
That's the dream, right? But then there's the other side, the competition. Always having to be on.
The hours are irregular, you're always on the road, and there's that constant possibility of just totally bombing. It's not an easy life.
So you need to be tough, but also vulnerable at the same time.
Yeah, for sure.
What does it actually take in terms of skill to be good at this? What are we talking about beyond just being funny?
Well, it's interesting, right? You'd think it was all about comedic timing
Yeah.
or, just being naturally quick-witted.
Right.
But when you look at the research from RoleCatcher, it actually involves a really diverse range of skills.
Okay, so break it down. What kind of skills are we talking about here?
A lot of it comes down to just being a great communicator,
Right.
which I guess makes sense, but in ways you might not expect. Like, they highlight things like reading comprehension and active listening, which I thought was interesting.
Really? I wouldn't have put those at the top of the list for comedians.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. To craft those really sharp jokes, you have to have a really deep understanding of language.
Yeah.
And active listening, that's how you read the room.
Oh,
You're gauging how people are reacting. You're adjusting on the fly. It's almost like a conversation with the audience, even though they're not the ones with the microphone.
yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about delivering a monologue. It's about being in the moment, reading the room, like you said.
Yeah, it's almost like this sixth sense that comedians develop, this social perceptiveness, as RoleCatcher calls it.
Okay, say more about that because what does that even mean in the context of telling jokes on stage?
Well, every audience is different, right?
Right.
What they find funny, what they connect with, it all changes depending on who's in the room. Comedians, they need to be able to read those subtle cues, adjust their material, and connect with that specific group of people.
So they're like amateur sociologists in a way,
Kinda, yeah.
analyzing group dynamics and predicting how different jokes are going to land.
Exactly. And then there's a psychological element, too,
Yeah.
which RoleCatcher talks about, because you're exploring the human condition, right?
Right.
Fears, desires, insecurities, that's all right material for comedy. So to make people laugh, you kind of need to understand what makes them tick.
That's true. The best comedians can tap into those universal truths that everyone relates to, even if we don't always want to admit it.
Totally. It's almost therapeutic.
It is. Okay, so we've got this unique blend of communication, social awareness, even psychology. What other skills feed into being successful in stand-up?
Well, they draw from a lot of different areas, which I thought was interesting, like fine arts. For understanding performance, obviously, their native language is super important, especially if they're crafting culturally specific humor.
Oh, right.
And even communications and media, because it's not just what you say, but how you work a crowd,
It's
right?
true. It's true. So it's really this incredibly diverse toolbox that they're drawing from. But let's talk about the journey. Where does someone even begin if they want to do stand-up? It's not like there's a stand-up comedy 101 class at most colleges.
No, not really. Although that would be cool.
Right.
But RoleCatcher, they talk about this pretty classic path. It often starts with open mics, which are terrifying.
Oh, I bet.
Can you imagine getting up on stage in front of a bunch of strangers with untested material?
Yeah, talk about trial by fire.
Yeah, but it's also the best way to learn what works.
Right. You bomb enough times, you start to figure it out.
Exactly. And you learn how to deal with hecklers, how to think on your feet.
So it's a grind, but if you can make it through those open mic nights, then you might start getting booked for some smaller gigs, maybe open for bigger names.
Right, and that's where you start to really hone your craft, build a following, maybe even get noticed by some industry people.
Assuming you're putting in the work, of course.
Oh, yeah?
Writing new material, refining your act, traveling to all these gigs.
That's not a side hustle.
Not at all.
It's a lot of work, a lot of rejection. But the rewards can be huge, right?
Yeah.
Like headlining your own shows, performing at festivals. Maybe you get a Netflix special.
Yeah.
That's the dream.
Right. And nowadays, a big part of that journey involves building a strong online presence.
Right.
Now,
Oh, absolutely. Social media is crucial for comedians now. It's how they connect with fans, share their work, basically build their own brand.
it's like they're creating their own opportunities, kind of bypassing the traditional gatekeepers of the industry.
Exactly, which is really interesting to see how technology is shaping comedy. But even with all the tools and platforms in the world, it still comes down to that raw talent.
You got to be funny.
Yeah. You got to make people laugh.
That's the magic ingredient, the it factor. And speaking of it factors, RoleCatcher themselves actually offer some really cool resources for aspiring comedians, right?
Yeah, it seems like they've got a ton of great advice, especially if you're serious about getting into stand-up. I was checking out their interview prep section. It's really in-depth.
Oh, yeah, their resources are super helpful. Like, they've got this database of potential interview questions, which, I mean, can you imagine
Oh, man.
having to interview for a comedy gig?
Yeah, that's got to be tough.
Talking about your, like, comedic influences while trying to be professional.
Right, like, I'm hilarious, hire me. Exactly.
Yeah.
But RoleCatcher, they actually tailor their questions to specific career paths, which is cool.
Oh, that's smart.
So you're not getting this, like, generic advice,
Yeah.
It's tailored for stand-up.
It's like having a cheat sheet for the comedy world. And it's not just the questions. They even have, like, AI-powered feedback on your responses.
It's wild how technology is changing everything. It's like having a virtual comedy coach in your pocket. They can give you feedback on your delivery, your timing.
That's incredible, especially in such a competitive field.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. They have AI for CV and resume tailoring, too.
Oh, yeah, which is so important. You can't just have a generic resume these days.
Right.
RoleCatcher, their AI, it can actually analyze job descriptions and figure out what skills and experience that employer is looking for.
So you stand out from the crowd. In a field like stand-up, where you're basically the product, that's got to be huge.
It's essential. You got to have every advantage you can get.
Absolutely. But even with the best tools and the best resources, it still comes down to that thing that makes someone funny.
Right. What is that, though?
What is that it factor? It's like you can't teach it.
You can't bottle it. It's some combination of wit, timing, stage presence.
Yeah, and vulnerability, I think, too.
Yeah, and a deep understanding of, like, what makes people tick.
It's about being able to find the humor and the unexpected, the stuff we all relate to, even the things that make us uncomfortable. And it's got to be relatable, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like you're saying something that everyone's thinking, but no one's saying.
Yeah, and being able to laugh at ourselves, laugh at these shared experiences, it's kind of what connects us.
It's a powerful thing, laughter. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of stand-up comedy.
It's been fun.
It has. We've explored the challenges, the triumphs, the honestly surprising range of skills you need to be successful in this field.
And we talked about some really cool resources for anyone who wants to give it a try, like RoleCatcher. Definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, hopefully you've enjoyed this deep dive. Maybe you've even realized you've got what it takes to get on stage yourself.
Go for it. The world needs more laughter.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.